Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Sports Lock Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Mostaller. And tonight we have the 2024 AFC East Fantasy Football Preview. We've done the North, we've done the South, now over to the East. If you haven't listened to the first two videos, make sure you subscribe here on YouTube at Sports Lock Podcast, as well as we are now on Spotify at Sports Lock Podcast. So make sure to check it out over there. Maybe you're at work or on a drive and you want to listen to it that way, do so over there. Make sure to share it no matter what, and also follow on Instagram and TikTok for up-to-date information. As you know, we prepare you for fantasy football at the end of the previews here of the divisions. We will have sleepers, busts, and rankings for you before a lot of people will draft before the start of the season, after the preseason's over with. And we will be having weekly videos throughout the whole entire football season. When we get into the season, it'll be weekly bets, predictions, and so on, daily fantasy. So let's get started tonight with the 2024 AFC East Fantasy Football Preview. So last year, the Bills, they were 11-6. The Dolphins, 11-6 right behind them, finishing second in the division. And third were the Jets at 7-10. And we had the Patriots in last at 4-13. Last year, I thought the Bills would be 12-5, so just one game off there. I thought the Jets would be 11-6. Obviously, they struggled there with no Aaron Rodgers the whole entire season. So they do a lot worse. And the Dolphins I had at 10-7. They go to 11-6, so one game off. And then last I had the Patriots doing a little bit better at 7-10. They ended up going 4-13. So we were a little bit closer than the other divisions with the Bills and the Dolphins. Well, let's get into it and see who I think is going to win the division this year. We're going to start with the Bills, who won last year at 11-6. They did lose there in a heartbreaking game against the Chiefs, who went on to win the Super Bowl, of course, in the divisional round. This year, they had more losses than gains, obviously losing Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis hurts. And then you have the addition of Curtis Samuel, really doesn't fit the mold. So where do they go there? And where do you go with the best quarterback in fantasy in the last few years, in Josh Allen? He finished QB1 for the third time in 4 seasons. He was second in 2022 with 4,306 yards, which was fourth best out of quarterbacks, 29 touchdowns, which was tied fifth, and he had the worst interception numbers at 18. So you look at those stats and you say, there's no way he could finish first. But of course, it is in the rushing game where he carried 524 yards, which was fourth best amongst quarterbacks last year, and 15 touchdowns, which was tied first with Jalen Hurts. He's going to lose out on his top 2 wide receivers, and I think that's going to hurt him in the passing numbers. But I think it's going to force him to be better than he's ever been. And I still think that he's going to finish QB1, at worst QB2, because he finished so far ahead of Jalen Hurts that if you just drop those numbers down a little bit from the passing game, he's still ahead of him. So I do think there's no way he throws 18 interceptions again. He's got to get better with that. Maybe he only throws 25 touchdowns. But if you still give him double-digit touchdowns on the ground and 500 rushing yards, he'll still be QB1. And I still think that's where he should go, is the QB1, which is also where ESPN ranks him. James Cook finished RB12 last year with 1,122 yards, and that was fourth best amongst running backs. 2 touchdowns and 4 receiving touchdowns. He did finish the season hot. I was lucky enough to have him in fantasy. That helped save me from getting last. Now, take a look at those numbers. 2 touchdowns and 4 receiving touchdowns, 6 touchdowns. I don't think that that's going to happen this year. I think he will do a lot better. He's going to get more receptions in the passing game due to Diggs and Davis leaving. And I think he has a lot of potential, a lot of upside to finish closer to a top 5 running back. Now, conservatively, I have him as my RB11, ESPN RB12, because I think there are some guys that you just expect to do a lot better. But he does have that upside and that potential. And he's a solid RB1, in my opinion, if you're waiting on a running back here later on. If you go wide receiver first, you go with a guy such as one of the top 3 wide receivers. Hill, you go with Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jamar Chase, CeeDee Lamb, and you need a running back, he'll be there when you come back around. And I would be happy to have him as a starting running back this year. I just think he has a lot more upside than he does have a floor, which is what you want to look for in running backs, because you know that they just have a lot of potential and you know that they're going to improve. So the wide receiver group is probably the worst Josh Allen's ever thrown to. You have Khalil Shakir, who was wide receiver 58, 39 receptions, 611 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And he was a wide receiver 3/4 on the team last year. Curtis Samuel comes in from Washington, wide receiver 42 with 62 receptions, 613 yards, and 4 touchdowns. And then they drafted Keon Coleman as the first pick in the second round from Florida State, who I think has a lot of upside as well. But it's really hard to tell who's going to take over. And it's one of those things that you want to wait to draft any Bills wide receiver until the preseason is over with. Shakir is listed as a wide receiver 1 on the team, and he has the connection already. So you expect that he will technically be the wide receiver 1, but it could easily be Coleman. It could easily be Samuel. So right now, a lot of them are sitting outside the top 50. So they're not even guys that I'm looking to draft. But there could be somebody that I look at after the preseason, and when we do the preseason rankings for fantasy, that I say, all right, he's moving up my board. But if I were drafting today, I would avoid these guys. The guy I would take, though, is the tight end Dalton Kincaid. He came in sharing time with Dawson Knox last year, but finished tight end 11, 73 receptions, 673 yards, and 2 touchdowns. I see him improving as well. I don't think he does any worse. I think he's closer to 80 receptions, 5 touchdowns. I have him up the board at tight end 6, ESPN a little bit higher at tight end 5. I think that's pretty much, there's one guy named George Kittle that I have a little bit higher that ESPN is always lower on. But he's going to be around there. He's a solid guy. And once your top guys go off the board, like your Kelce's and Andrews, he is a guy that I would be happy with having as my starting tight end, because of course, once the first tight end goes, they seem to all fall. So if you can get a guy like a Kincaid, like a Evan Engram we talked about last time, and people like that, they have the upside to finish in the top 3, but you're getting them at a discount there. Normally the tight ends fall off. I think they're a little bit deeper this year, maybe the top 8 or 10. So you shouldn't be too unhappy if you fall on one of those guys. I think right now, 7 is George Kittle, and then you're going outside of that range. David Njoku, who had an amazing season last year. So there's more solid tight ends this year than ever before. So I think you want to grab one of those guys, but you don't have to rush as much as you would have in past years, where, it was either Kelce or Andrews or Kittle at the time, that if you didn't grab, you were screwed. That's not the case this year. Again, Knox, Hawkinson, Engram, you have McBride, guys like that are just going to dominate and have that, top 3 tight end potential. So their defense was top 3. That's what's really keeping them alive. And they have the best quarterback in the league, but this is the poorest wide receiver core in Allen's career. How's he going to adjust to that? Last year they go 11-6. I projected 12-5. This year I'm going to go 10-7. They do have a tougher schedule with the loss of their wide receiver core. Finishing first last year in the division means tougher games. So I could see them easily being 9-8, but I think 10-7 is pretty good guess. Next, we have the Miami Dolphins. They were also 11-6, but finished second in the division. They got blown out in Kansas City in that really, really cold game last year, 26-7. Their key additions on the offense is wide receiver Odell Beckham Jr. and tight end Jonnu Smith. Now, Tua Tagovailoa finished QB 11. He was He led the passing game, 4,624 yards, 29 touchdowns, which was tied 5th, and 14 interceptions. So not bad stats there for him. He did start off hot and kind of slowed down a little bit, but they had an amazing running game with Mostert and A-Chain, which we're going to talk about here in a second. I don't see him getting as many yards. I don't think he leads the league in passing. But he's being really undervalued. I don't see a reason why he would decline so poorly that ESPN has him as QB 19. I think he's a very big sleeper at that spot. You have your best wide receiver in the league in Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, who is a very good wide receiver. Now you add Odell Beckham Jr. I think Tua will go off again. Is he going to be QB5? I don't think so. I think he'll be around QB10, but nowhere near QB19. I'd be all right with having Tua as my starting quarterback. Do I want him to be? Not really, but if he's a backup, I would take it. So take it as it is, but he is a big sleeper for me this year. At so far this season, he might be the biggest sleeper. But another sleeper, I think, is Raheem Mostert, who ESPN's sleeping on as well. Him and A-Chain, if you recall last year, were like a 1-2 punch. They were like the Montgomery Gibbs up in Detroit. But Mostert finished RB5 with over 1,000 rushing yards, 18 touchdowns on the ground, career high and best in the league, and 3 receiving touchdowns, where A-Chain finished RB24 with 800 yards, 8 touchdowns, and 3 receiving touchdowns. So 21 touchdowns for Mostert and 11 touchdowns there for A-Chain is insane out of running back group. A-Chain, I think, is going to have more opportunity this year. He's younger, and I think they're going to try to give him the ball more. But Mostert's still the RB1. After he performed what he did last year, they're not just going to take him out of the game. And ESPN thinks that. ESPN has him as the RB35. How do you go from RB5 to RB35? I just don't get it. I have him as my RB23. I don't think he finishes RB5. I don't think he's going to have another career year at his age with 21 total touchdowns. But give him maybe 10, 11, 12 rushing touchdowns, he'd still be a top 25 running back. I think A-Chain they're way too high on because of that reason. They have him as the RB13. He's my RB19. I do think he does finish ahead of Mostert this year because if you look, there's really only a 200-yard rushing difference, the same receiving touchdowns, and I think they're going to be more even in the rushing game, and it'll be more of a series, but I think they're still dominant, and I think people are sleeping on Mostert. And if you can get him at that RB35 range as a backup running back or a flex play, I think you got a solid option there. Now the wide receivers, Hill, Waddle, and OBJ. Hill capped off another amazing season with 119 receptions, which was second best. He almost had 1,800 yards, which was first best, and 13 touchdowns, which was tied first with Mike Evans. That is back-to-back seasons now that Tyreek Hill finished as a wide receiver 2. Jalen Waddle finished wide receiver 34 in 14 games, 72 receptions, 1,000 yards, and 4 touchdowns. OBJ finished with 35 receptions, 565 yards, and 3 touchdowns. He did miss a few games there. Now, Hill should still go off. I think he still has over 100 receptions, possibly around 1,500 yards, and maybe closer to 10 touchdowns. Even with that, he's still wide receiver 2 on the list. He could easily finish as wide receiver 1. There's guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jamar Chase that could easily finish in front of him. But if you draft Tyreek Hill with one of your top picks, I believe right now he is going about 3rd overall. So if you have a top 3 pick and you land on Tyreek Hill, you're going to be really happy. He's just been very consistent and nothing saying that he's going to go down. Waddle, I think, will improve slightly. Again, he missed some games. Right now, I have him as wide receiver 23, ESPN a little bit higher at wide receiver 20. And OBJ right now is really not being drafted, but a guy you want to watch because he has a lot of potential, especially if Hill or Waddle are injured this season. Jonnu Smith is added from Atlanta. He finished tight end 15 last year, 50 receptions, 582 yards, and 3 touchdowns. I think the receptions are going to fall a little bit when you got guys like Tyreek Hill, Waddle, and OBJ on your team. They're going to get a bulk of the load and 2 amazing running backs, but he's still going to be there. He's my tight end 24, ESPN tight end 28. So you might draft him as a backup tight end. I wouldn't be, wanting this guy, really overly wanting him on my team. But if he falls to you as a backup, it's not the end of the world. Their defense was top 5 as well. The pros are the same offenses coming back. And the cons can Tua stay healthy to lead the team to win the division. I think there's an opportunity there. They were 11-6 last year. I projected 10-7. This year I'm going 9-8. I think, again, a little bit tougher of a schedule. they're a team that seems to falter late, and they have some tougher games there towards the end of the season. So with that being said, I'm going to say 9-8. The Patriots. I don't really even want to talk about the Patriots. There's nothing exciting here about them. They were 4-13 last year, and that was their worst record under Bill Belichick and the worst record for the team since 1992. And what are their key additions? They get Jacoby Brissett from Washington, and they draft Drake May out of North Carolina with the 3rd overall pick. Now, right now, Jacoby Brissett is listed as the starter, but I easily think after the preseason that it will be Drake May. They really both don't offer much in fantasy this year. May's QB 23 on ESPN. I have him more QB 30-ish. Brissett's QB 36 for me, ESPN QB 43. So I have him a little bit higher because if he does start and play some games ahead of May as he's listed right now, he will be a little bit higher, but I'd avoid both of those guys. Ramondre Stevenson is really the only guy that you'd look to draft in fantasy on this team, really. He finished RB 35 with 619 yards and 4 touchdowns in 12 games. If he was healthy, though, he was on pace to finish inside the top 20. With uncertainty at quarterback, they're going to rely on Ramondre a lot this season. I like him. He's my RB20, ESPN RB18, so we're right around that range. Again, I think he's an all right RB2 on your team, especially if you go wide receiver, and then a top running back, or wide receiver, running back, wide receiver. If he's your RB2, I wouldn't be totally upset. I think he does have some upside there because he will be the only guy on the team, but that means defenses are really going to key in on him. Wide receivers are really nothing to talk about either. Just like the Bills, Kendrick Bourne right now is the top guy. Wide receiver 65 last year. I'd be staying away from any Patriots wide receiver. You did it last year. Why do it this year with a new quarterback? A guy you may consider as a backup would be Hunter Henry. He started the season off hot, but then kind of faltered. 6 touchdowns, 42 receptions, 419 yards. It's really hard to judge how he'll do with the new quarterbacks. But I have him tight end 22. ESPN does as well. So in some leagues, he might be your backup. Again, am I overly thrilled to have him? Not really. But there could be some potential there with the safety valve in Hunter Henry. Defense was bad. They're normally a great defense. They're terrible. Let's hope the draft helps improve this team, but otherwise this is just going to be a really bad team. I think there's potential to finish as the worst team in the NFL. I have them going 3-14 this year. Last year they went 4-13. I projected 7-10. Lastly, we have the New York Jets, who finished 3rd in the division last year at 7-10. Their big key addition this year is wide receiver Mike Williams from the Chargers. Now, Aaron Rodgers is coming off ankle surgery that, of course, ended the season, unfortunately, right there in the first game, one of the few snaps of the game. So he is looking to be back. He should be starting. He's my QB 18, though, ESPN QB 12. They're a lot higher on him. Now, Aaron Rodgers is an MVP type caliber player, but when you've missed a season due to injury, coming back off of that, plus he's 40 years old. I just can't see him finishing QB 12. So I'm dropping him down to QB 18. I think he's going to be a bust this year, especially for somebody that they're saying in a 12-man league should be your starter. I would not take Aaron Rodgers as my starter. I'd take him as a backup if you have somebody solid starting. You know, if you land on one of the top 5 quarterbacks, I wouldn't mind Rodgers as a backup, but I'm not really there sold on having him as a starter like ESPN does. Breece Hall finished RB2 last year, having a career year, mainly thanks to the receiving game. He led running backs with 76 receptions and 591 yards, 4 touchdowns in the passing game. He then almost had 1,000 rushing yards and 5 touchdowns there. So I think he'll improve even more in the rushing game. I think he's a 1,000-yard rusher there. He is the guy now in New York. He might not receive the receiving numbers that he did last year because it was a lot of checkdowns. He might be more in the 50-ish range receptions, but I still think that he could get 4 touchdowns. And with that being said, I think RB2 is fair for him. ESPN thinks so as well. I think other than Christian McCaffrey, who dominated last year and should this year and be the consensus number 1 overall pick, I think there's a few guys you could go with here: Breece Hall, Saquon Barkley, Bijan Robinson, guys like that I wouldn't be upset if guys like that, or be surprised if guys like that would go ahead of Breece Hall. But I do think he's a solid value in that range, and I have him just slightly ahead of RB2 because he finished that well last year. Garrett Wilson finished wide receiver 26, 95 receptions, over 1,000 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Of course, that was without Aaron Rodgers. They had Mike Williams, who was injured last year. 2 good wide receivers for Rodgers to throw to. Obviously, last year, but he had high hopes of Garrett Wilson, drafting him really high because of Aaron Rodgers. I had him for one of my picks, and unfortunately, that didn't go too well because of the Rodgers injury. However, still wide receiver 26 isn't too terrible with that, and almost 100 receptions. So with that being said, if Rodgers is healthy, we're going to do this again this year. He's my wide receiver 8, ESPN wide receiver 7. And for me, Mike Williams is somewhere around wide receiver 49. ESPN has him wide receiver 50. I think he does have a lot of potential if he comes healthy to be a top receiver there for Aaron Rodgers as well, and could finish a lot better. So maybe a sleeper there. Tight ends Tyler Conklin finished tight end 16 with 61 receptions, 621 yards. Unfortunately, no touchdowns. But I do think he'll get a few touchdowns this season. I don't see that they're going to not throw the ball to him in the end zone. So with that being said, he's my tight end 17, ESPN tight end 18. Again, not a guy that I want as my starting tight end, but won't be a bad backup tight end. He has, I think, a lot of upside this season, more than he does a floor. Their defense is top 5. They're getting Rodgers back, which is awesome. But the question is, can the offense stay healthy to lead that team? The defense did a lot last year to help. So if that can continue, I think that they win the division. I have them going 11-6. That's what I projected last year. We're going back to it. If we're going back to Wilson being a top 10 fantasy wide receiver, we're going back to the Jets winning this division. Last year, of course, they were 7-10. I do think they can improve a few games there. So the sleepers and busts for me, the sleepers are Tua Tagovailoa. We talked about how he did last year. I don't see him really declining much. ESPN thinks that he'll have a big decline, but I still think that he'll easily be a top 15 quarterback. Raheem Mostert is a huge sleeper, right now listed at RB35. I just don't see that happening after your RB5, and really nothing's changing besides maybe giving A-Chain more looks. So I think Mostert is a big sleeper there. The bust, I think, is Aaron Rodgers. Just his age, the injury, and the first time playing really in 2 years. I don't see him being a top 15 quarterback, especially closer to a top 10 quarterback, as ESPN says. He's dropping closer to QB 20 for me. And the quarterback, Drake May, he's not even a starter yet, and they have him listed as a QB 23 ahead of guys that are already starting. I don't like that, so I would avoid him, and he is a bust for me. The East standings, I have the Jets at 11-6, the Bills at 10-7, the Dolphins at 9-8, and the Patriots at a whopping 3-14. And that's a podcast for you guys this week. So thanks for listening in. Make sure to follow over on the other platforms on TikTok and Instagram at sportslockpodcast. Make sure you check the podcast out on Spotify. And if you're listening on Spotify, thank you for tuning in at sportslockpodcast. And of course, subscribe here on YouTube at sportslockpodcast. And make sure you share it with your friends that enjoy this type of stuff. Next week, we will be back to wrap up the AFC with the AFC West. Before the week after that, we then get into the NFC. Thanks for listening. Enjoy your 4th of July. Have a good one.